address. Brandon Arnold is Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union. Brandon, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me, Lars.
So all this inflation that we've seen, where Joe Biden's, the only time he celebrates is when he says, well, it's lower than it was last year, and it's lower than it was the year before that, but is still dramatically higher than it was the day he took the oath of office, and dramatically higher than it had been in the 10 previous years. Was all of this and our massive increase in national debt more or less predictable?
Yeah, I guess so. You'd hoped when Republicans took over the House of Representatives, at least, that we'd start to be able to roll back some of the spending. We'd start to see some check on the Biden administration. Unfortunately, it hasn't materialized as much as we would have liked it. Certainly, we haven't had any bills of the magnitude of the American Rescue Plan Act, which he passed shortly after becoming president, or the Inflation Reduction Act, which provided trillions of dollars in special interest tax breaks to renewable energy companies and electric vehicle purchasers. But we still haven't had the type of spending restraint that we've needed to really put a check on inflation. That's why, even though things have improved somewhat, I should say they're not getting bad at the same rate that they were in previous years. They're still getting bad. They're still going in the wrong direction. Prices are still going up. And a lot of people are being left behind in this economy due to really high interest rates, persistent inflation, and just a crummy economy for a lot of people.
I mean, if you went back to the inflation rates before Biden took office, and I always think of things as before Joe and after Joe, but we would in 10 years see prices increase 17 to 20%, 1.7 to 2% a year for 10 years. Now we're looking at, if we could hold inflation to the roughly 3.5 we're at now, if it doesn't go higher, and it doesn't seem likely for it to go lower, in the next 10 years, we're going to see it go up by almost twice as much as it would have otherwise. So you're right. It's bad and getting worse, just not getting worse at the rate it was for a period of time in the middle of the Biden administration. So why do you suppose it is that we can't get the United States government, especially in the form of the Congress, to say, look, we're spending ourselves into an absolutely impossible debt, and I mean impossible literally, where the amount of interest we'll have to pay on it will supersede or eclipse every other function of government?
Yeah, well, first let me just add that some of the inflationary pressure is created not by spending, but on bad regulatory policy. The Biden administration can act unilaterally there. It doesn't need the assent of Congress, for instance, to restrict energy production, which it did early in its administration. It didn't need the assent of Congress to raise tariffs, which drove up consumer prices and prices for manufacturers, to put price controls on prescription drugs and so forth. So it did a lot of bad stuff that Congress doesn't really have the ability to stop. But then moving into current Congress, when once again the House should have been more effective in putting a check on Biden's spending, there has been zero unanimity amongst House Republicans on how to proceed and how to push back. There's just been so much infighting, so much disarray, that even under the new speaker, who I think is doing an admirable job, but far from perfect, he's doing an admirable job. We just haven't had the level of coordination that we need in order to give the speaker an opportunity to really negotiate against Schumer and Biden on spending cuts and getting this nation back on track.
But why is it so hard to get to that unanimity? Because I could see that if one group wants us to be very conservative about spending, and then the other group wants us to be conservative but not quite as conservative as, say, the Freedom Caucus, they'd at least arrive at some point that's well below Joe Biden's level of spending. But you're telling me that because one group says no, it's got to be more conservative, so we're not even willing to go for somewhat more conservative. Is it a matter of degrees?
It is, and you're trying to apply logic and rational thought to the operations of Congress, which is a big mistake.
Sorry about that.
Apology accepted. Yeah, I mean, listen, it's a directional fight, in my opinion here. It's a directional fight, and getting into the minutia of strategic approach and tactical approach and so forth. I think that's where everything has fallen apart. But what they ought to do is reset this whole conversation and directionally agree that the spending cannot continue. And if we got to that point, first of all, then we could begin that conversation about the level of cuts. And nobody's ever going to be happy. I think that's the other problem is you have 435 members of the House of Representatives, and each person thinks that they should be speaker and making all the decisions and getting their way 100% of the time. And that's just not how a legislative body functions. You have to realize that if you're going to get a directional change, especially under this enormous spending of the current president and the previous Congress, then that's a victory, even if it's not as good as we would like.
I don't understand why even the low-hanging fruit, things like, well, let's claw back all the unspent, supposedly money budgeted for an emergency, and the emergency is over. And then you say, okay, bring back all the unspent money. As I understand it, that's a substantial sum right now, and they could grab that without touching anything except Joe's reelection plans.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely one of the ideas that we've proposed to Congress. They've used it as a pay-for. They've used some other things that I think should be low-hanging fruit, like how about the Inflation Reduction Act? There were almost $1 trillion in tax credits there, targeted specifically toward renewable energy credits, to renewable energy companies, and to people, mostly wealthy people, who wanted to go out and buy a Tesla or another electric vehicle. Let's start clawing that stuff back. We should have unanimity across the Republican Party. And some Democrats even should be hesitant to support large companies, give them enormous tax credits, even if they support this green energy policy. So, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we could agree on. But first, they have to agree what day of the week it is. And then we can start getting the policy. We can unfortunately get to that point.
Well, I'll tell you what, at the very least, let's stop making the car companies make cars on which electric cars that they lose $60,000 every time they sell one. Brandon, thanks so much.